How is this strengths approach applied in practice? Well, that's the question I want to address in this particular presentation. At a superficial level, we're often asking people, how are you coping? What do you want to do? And that's as good a starting point as any. Those are important messages, much more important than just getting straight to the how are you not coping? What are you struggling with? What are you unable to do? At least this represents a shift in language, a shift in terminology, which is an important shift that shouldn't be underestimated in terms of just how these different questions are received and experienced. But it's not enough. If we're talking about a strengths approach, I'm talking about something very much more detailed. This is very much about who we are, a personal attitude, it's a value base. How much do we reflect and think about why we're doing the work we're doing? How we go about doing that work? How we think about the people, the clients, the patients, the customers that we're working with? And again, I emphasize this is about applying values and principles, but in a real sense, not just thinking of those as being academic words, academic ways of thinking belonging to a different person, not me. I'm challenging you to really think about how you respond to situations and people and challenges. Do we all too easily just get drawn into those negatives and those cliches that have been set up in earlier parts of the training? Or can we stand back and ultimately see another point here that I referred to earlier as really thinking about strengths as the default? So even though somebody might be presenting to you as a problem or with a problem, there's something about this being deeply ingrained in us, embedded in us. If we're recognizing the problem, that's what draws in our focus of attention. But are we instantly becoming alert to, aware of, and inquiring about the potential for strengths in and around the person and the situation? This is what I mean by it becoming a default position, not something that you'll come back and revisit just once in a while when you have time. And again, I want to emphasize this last question. Where does this fit with appreciating people's problems? It's not an either or. We're offering a counterbalance. If you take the whole picture of me, it would include what I can do, what I want to do, what I'm interested in, my achievements, my desires for the future. All of that's the strength side of me. But there's also a problems side. The aging, the creaking back, the times that I don't connect with people as well as I'd like to. Various things that I'm just being honest, I'm not very good at doing. All of these different elements make up the picture of me. And if I'm working with people as a practitioner, then clearly they present with problems. But I'm looking at strengths as being resources to direct towards those problems, to support people to manage their own problems through their recognition and application of their own strengths. So these two things, there's problems and strengths, they go hand in hand. They're not an either or. There's a good image in a sense, or a good message. It's what's your story? That's essentially what this is all about. How do we put it into practice? It's actually about encouraging people to tell their story. It's primarily about what you do in your interactions with people. So again, you can build up that formalized assessment. But the what's the story is also a more informal approach. And it happens when? Well, from the very first point of contact. Again, if it's a default position, we're always alert to strengths information, seeking out strengths information. So in our first contact or discussion with people, Or if you're working on a referral basis, the information that comes through the written referrals or whatever, you will be demanding, inquiring, searching for strengths as well as the more obviously presented problems information. And you'll be doing that right from the outset. The how, in terms of going about this, involves degrees of paperwork. Doesn't everything? Though I always want to keep that to an absolute minimum. I want to take a bureaucracy busting approach. And that, I promise you, is another one of my personal default positions. And if you look at the resources, and I hope you will, within this module, there's a strengths assessment as well as a strengths-based support plan and guidance notes going with them. It's very minimal amounts of paperwork, which is there to guide and reflect on what you're doing in practice. It's not there to become the be-all and end-all. It's not your priority there just to fill in paperwork. It literally is the minimum, and I will outline those in detail in the next part of this module. It's there to underpin and support what you're doing, because ultimately we're remembering, and this goes for risk as well as for strengths equally, that reality is dynamic. It's constantly changing. So the documents, the paperwork that we would be using also needs as best as possible to capture and reflect that change, that dynamism. But there's the dilemma. It could never be an exact replica of real life. Life is dynamic, and with the best will in the world, paperwork is a static picture. So the design needs to be something that is minimal and manageable if we're really going to connect with the notion of updating it or on a regular basis. Again, staying with the question about how, it's about using the client's resources. I say clients, but of course that term will change depending on the field of work that you're involved in and what term suits who you serve the best. Whether it's in health or social care or any other business, it's primarily about working with what is in and around the person. So yes, I'm repeating some of these messages because they're well worth repeating, because they're important messages. Working with what are essentially the resources that the person has themselves or has close to themselves, such as carers or family members, for example. Friends may also help to access information about who the client is. They might help you to understand who the person is. So let's take a classic example of dementia, where somebody perhaps in the more advanced state is not so able to really give you that clear and honest picture of what's going on, or a true reflection of what their strengths are. That's not to say that they won't be able to, or they can't to some degree, in some level. And it may well be that it comes more through your own observations of the person. But we could well be looking at resources then around the person, such as the family members, who might be able to help build up that picture. But again, they themselves might be seeing all the negatives that go with something like dementia. So it's up to us, as the external person, to prompt, to guide them to also be thinking more about the person, let's say when they were younger, or when they were in a different, let's say, earlier phase or earlier onset of the illness or condition, and help those around them to build up the picture of what they looked like then, what they did, what was important to them in that earlier stage of life. And you'll see, as an approach, it can be good for getting to know who the person really is beneath the dementia condition. Bearing in mind issues of confidentiality, of course. Dementia is a good example, particularly if we're minded to be aware of more recent service developments around the concepts of, or the initiatives for, building dementia-friendly communities. In this instance, We can then be thinking more widely, like shopkeepers, neighbours, the GP, pharmacists, housing staff, and even specific members of the general public when we're connecting with these types of forward thinking initiatives. It becomes very important to have prompts as to how we can tap into all of these resources around people. People need that kind of help, and we need to build it. So, if I remind you again, when we're thinking of strengths, we're thinking of resources. And those strengths and resources could lie within so many other people in the local neighbourhood. We're ultimately trying to pick up on what's the person good at? What are their strengths? What's their story? These are the kind of questions that we want to be continually referring to. It represents change. Change in what? What change? We're in a world of constant change. So what's this about? Well, I'm going to suggest to you, as you'll see from this slide, appreciating the focus on strengths involves how it relates to people, how it relates to staff members or employees in the organisation, how it relates to the whole organisation itself. It should be an approach applied equally at all of these levels. But that takes a shift in thinking, a culture of thinking to get people and organisations thinking in this way, which would then tap in very much to one of the many messages from the Gallup organisation about how all the most successful businesses around the world would have adopted this way of thinking to a greater or lesser, generally a greater extent. This becomes part of their culture, this becomes part of their approach to their business. But it's also changing the focus on the tools that we're using. So we need to develop the appropriate tools to prompt this kind of positive practice. We need to shift the focus from just training people to developing people and having the tools there to develop people. And again, you'll see some of that in the resources that are within this module. And thinking about how building up, using these tools, we build up that picture of strengths. We build up that picture of resources. And this can help support us then to take the risk, putting positive risk taking into real practice with confidence. And then there's that whole world of measurement. Is it working? Can we create more evidence around each individual situation? Well, measuring that which has meaning for people becomes more important, not measuring that which is important to systems and what they want to gain. This isn't about churning out stuff that is great for the world of audit with a narrow and misdirected focus on just keeping auditors happy. We need to focus in on what is important to individual people. And we're going to support them to make the change that's important to them. How are we going to measure that change? Well, we're going to have to shift the targets to start with, change the whole notion of expectations around measurement of what we're doing. And that again contributes to a very significant shift in the culture of thinking. It's summed up in this image to an extent. Shooting for the moon, at least occasionally. And again, I think in terms of that grand scheme, that grand design, that grand wish that I or you or anybody might have for themselves personally. It's also that grand wish about shifting the culture of thinking for the organisation that sometimes, I have to say, from my experience, particularly experience working in alongside organisations and teams, it does feel like quite often we need to give ourselves a collective permission to just try to shoot for the moon. And if we do, just once in a while, you might get there. Change is something we resist, so why make the change? Well, positive risk taking with an understanding of personal strengths supports that sharper focus on the needs of the individual. Now, I refer there to needs, but it could more importantly be the wishes of the individual, the dreams of the individual. So we need to make the change if we're really going to implement positive risk taking with confidence. And again, as with all other modules across the whole of this course, it's about having that sharp focus on the person, for the person, supporting the person. Because you'll see there, we all have dreams, have wishes, and taking a risk is often a prerequisite to actually achieving those dreams, those wishes. And there's a word of caution or phrase, of course, at the end. You deny anyone that opportunity to take risks, particularly for the positive gains and the dreams and the wishes, then what you're likely to do is just raise the stakes. The danger is that we might create more of the risk by inadvertently depriving people from taking the risk. Why take a risk? Well, change is often accompanied by fear and anxiety. It's always easier to talk about this than to do it. Talking the talk, many people can do that. But what is it about walking the walk? And I again have to emphasize walking the walk in positive risk taking has to be underpinned by a strengths approach. I hope the messages are beginning to come over here that we're talking resources boosting confidence. It's about this hopefulness that we're trying to instill for people and their experience and their connection with us. Whether that's in our business, whatever that may be, we need to ask, well, what are we offering staff in the organisation? Those employees. How do we help them to experience a more hopeful way of working? And certainly, I would always argue that the strengths approach and the focus on positive risk taking raises hope. And it can generate a much more positive feeling in people about the work that they're doing. This raises the question about why take the risks for the organisation? What expectations do they hold within themselves as senior managers and of their employees and of their customers, as well as for their customers and clients? There are a whole lot of reasons why at these different levels, again, we should be taking the risk, but doing it from a strengths perspective. Reflect back on the content of this presentation and make your notes on how you're currently applying a strengths approach in practice, and your thoughts about what you and your colleagues can change in order to implement it in a deeper way. Also, take a look at the PDF document Interviewing for Client Strengths. This might prompt different ways in which you might think of eliciting some of this kind of information from the people that you're working with. And in the next presentation, I'm going to focus in more detail on the tools, the strengths-based tools that I've just been referring to.